classical creation myths. That's going to be our topic for the next several presentations. We'll be looking at origin myths, particularly out of ancient Greece, but we'll also be including some others from places as well. Notice that I've put the word creation in scare quotes there. That's because that word might be a bit confusing or a bit distracting for most 21st century Westerners today. And so just kind of set it aside for now. We'll be catching up to that concept later. But before we get started talking about these origin myths, I want to introduce you to a German word, which is very useful. The word Weltanschauung. When I teach this course on campus and I have students in the classroom, I often ask if anyone there speaks German. And since very few people do, at least in America, of course lots of people in Germany speak German, but nobody complains about my pronunciation. Weltanschauung. Welt is the German word that means world. Anschauung means to look out at, outlook, out viewing. So it's usually translated, we can translate it into English as world perspective, or the very useful English word worldview. A worldview, or a Weltanschauung, is a useful concept. It's a very broad concept because it includes two different things at once. First, it includes an attitude towards the world. Some worldviews are very optimistic, some worldviews are very pessimistic. Although we won't get to them in this presentation. We'll be talking about some origin stories that come from two different writers. One is the Greek writer Hesiod, who's writing about 750 BC. The other is a Roman writer, Ovid, who's writing about around the time of Christ. They're separated by 750 years, which is a long time. And, we're going to discover that Hesiod's attitude towards the world is much more pessimistic than Ovid's attitude. And maybe that's because Hesiod lived 750 years earlier. I mean, if you take today's date and subtract 750 years, then we end up in the 1260s, 1270s, 1280s, around in there, when life was very different than it is today. Would anybody want to argue that, life in the 1280s was a lot easier than it is today? It's a lot harsher. Your life expectancy is a lot lower than it is today. Death is an ever-present reality. We're going to see that this includes things like an attitude towards the universe, an attitude towards humanity and humanity's role in the universe, and those kinds of things. But we also, when we think about a worldview, we also have a picture of the universe. And before we get started, I want to give you the standard picture that we find among peoples in many parts of the ancient world, but especially in the Eastern Mediterranean world. So we're talking about the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Hittites, the ancient Hebrew people, the ancient Babylonians, the ancient Assyrians, the ancient Persians, the ancient Egyptians. We're just working our way around the Eastern Mediterranean world there. And the way that this way of picturing the universe is usually described as a cake plate model. You've probably seen a cake plate before. You put the cake on the plate, and then you have the dome above the plate to keep the flies and the fruit flies and all the other bugs off of the cake. All right. You'll see why it's called a cake plate when you look at this diagram, because I think it's very useful for us. Many of the ancient people, and particularly those in the Eastern Mediterranean world, so we're talking about ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, ancient Hebrews, ancient Egyptians, ancient Babylonians, and so on, thought of the Earth, the planet Earth, as kind of like a round frisbee. It's kind of like this round, flat frisbee. Underneath the Earth, in fact, let me get some pointers going here so I can kind of draw some things for you. Okay. Let me... sorry about this. Okay. Okay, so we have the flat Earth here. Below the Earth is the underworld. That makes sense. It's under the world. Let's start with easy stuff. The underworld is under the Earth. The Earth rests on these pillars, the pillars of the Earth. The pillars of the Earth were shaken. That's what happens when an earthquake happens, see? What do the pillars of the Earth rest on? Well, we don't know. All right. Surrounding the Earth is the ocean. Here you see the primeval ocean on the little diagram here. Then the waters above the Earth are separated from the waters under the Earth. Okay, that's a line that comes out of the first Hebrew creation story in Genesis 1. The waters above the Earth and the waters under the Earth. And so you have the waters. We're supposed to have the waters. Here we go, coming up and circling above the Earth. If you picture the world this way, then this explains some things. For example, why is the sky blue? Well, when the sun, and here is the sun up in the firmament, when the sun shines in the sky, then it reflects off the water up here, and we see the blue sky. All right. Where does the rain come from? All right. The windows of heaven. Here's some windows up here. Are opened and the water drops down onto the earth. The hail is kept up here, you see, and so when there's a hailstorm, the hail is dropped on the earth. It kind of makes sense. And then you have this firmament thing, this kind of structure where the planets move around, the sun moves around, the moon moves around, and so on, and all these calculations kind of take place up there. So that is some vocabulary and some images and some concepts to think about as we start talking about these origin myths, these creation stories, although we'll figure out pretty quickly that might not be the best way to put it, but that's for